Dean's work and my friend Michelle Stahlbeck-Grimes for introducing me to the wonderful people involved with this foundation. It's been an amazing 36 hours. My friend Cameron and I flew up yesterday. We watched the Cowboys overtime win with the Stahlbeck family, and then toured the gorgeous George W. Bush Institute today with my favorite First Lady, Aunt Laura. So now I have the pleasure and honor of joining my fellow authors and all of you for this important celebration of reading. And when I thought about the name of this evening, I thought of how well that describes really my childhood. My mother was a librarian, like Aunt Laura. Okay, I'll stop doing that. And she always made books a priority in our home. Our family moved around a lot, really every 2 years because of my father's job. And one of the first things we always did when we got to a new town or city is get our library card. I was very shy as a child, and books became a refuge for me, and the characters in the books really became close friends. I have 3 children now, twins, Edward and George, who are 10, and my daughter Harriet, who is 7. And when I read my favorite books to them, some of my favorites from childhood, it really is like visiting old friends I haven't seen in decades. I've discovered that no matter how much you love books as an adult, it's not quite the same as the emotions you feel as a child, perhaps because everything's so much more intense when you're a child. And I think every child should have that experience of falling in love with books. My daughter Harriet is in the 2nd grade this year, and she was just diagnosed with dyslexia last year. She's lucky enough to be going to a special school, and things are finally starting to click for her. She's so excited and truly empowered by the simple ability to turn the pages of her first chapter book and read, and it's just been such a thrill for my husband and for me to watch. For me, and I'm sure many authors, the joy of reading really sparked my love of writing, and in many ways I think the two are interchangeable. From the time I was 6 years old, I wanted to be an author. I remember saying that in the 1st grade. I wrote poems and stories all the time, and I kept a journal. I got this locked diary in the 5th grade with a little, key to keep my sister out, and I did not skip a day from January 1st, 1983 through law school when I graduated in 97, not a single day, which I think speaks more to my OCD problem than my love of writing, but I never lost sight of that dream, but I briefly got sidetracked. I think I panicked at some point in college and felt that I had to do something practical, and I took the LSAT. So, like many people in this room, I've discovered tonight. I've never regretted attending the University of Virginia for law school or practicing for 5 years, but I truly detested that experience. Like the day that I learned how to work the computers and bill, I thought I've made a terrible mistake. But I discovered that misery can be very motivating, and as I paid back my $100,000 of debt, and to escape my jail time, is how Brad described it earlier, I wrote a book in my free time, or when I should have been billing, or perhaps was billing GE and Philip Morris. It was a flat rate that the firm was, so I justified it that way. But I was able to get an agent, and it was very exciting. I was told that getting an agent can be the most difficult thing, and it was very hopeful, and then the rejection letters rolled in one after the other until I hadn't heard from the last submission from my first agent, and kept trying to follow up with her. If we heard the status, I realized it's not good news, but I would really like closure. And she finally wrote back, yes, they all rejected it. And she didn't even put a period at the end of the sentence. It's like, I don't even get a punctuation mark. But it really was a crossroads in my life, and I'm so grateful that I decided to try again. And I quit my job, and I moved to London, and it was there that I gave myself a self-imposed 1-year deadline. It was for my father's sake, who was panicking about the economy and leaving a good job behind. But I gave myself this 1-year deadline. It took me about 14 months to write Something Borrowed. And I tried again. I sent it out to a new agent. And she submitted it, and she called me one day from New York. And I still remember that call. And it really is probably the most moment of pure joy in my life so far. And I feel very feel, a little sheepish saying that because I'm married to a wonderful man and I have 3 beautiful children. But your wedding day comes with a whole set of stress, and childbirth comes with quite a bit of pain, especially having twins. So this just ranks as the most, pure joy. So I'm now 7 books into the publishing journey, just begun my 8th recently, and I'm so grateful to be doing what I love for a living. And we were told to read from our books, and this is the point where I would do that, but I gave that up about 5 books ago. The exercise has always pained me. It's like sort of how you feel when you accidentally FaceTime and look down at the phone. It's like, oh. By the way, I love Kelly's work, and I was so happy to meet her today. We're with the same publisher, but kudos to you for talking about your lady parts and looking for the lady parts. Couldn't do it. But instead, I'll just say a few words about my latest book, The One and Only. It's a story it's an unconventional love story set in the big, bold world of Texas football. It's amazing how many people, not in the state of Texas, reporters would say, like, why Texas? I'm like, are you kidding me? Is that really a question? But in creating legendary, fictitious, of course, head coach Clive Carr and my fictional school, Walker University. Get it? W, Walker, Uncle George. But I came down to Dallas several times doing research, which included attending spring practices at SMU and sampling Dallas's best guacamole, which I think is in the lobby of the Ritz, with that guacamologist who appears, and the Mambo taxis at Mi Casina. So my husband would remark as I would leave town, and him with the 3 kids, that I really had it rough as a novelist. But for much of the story, I actually drew on my personal experiences. I grew up obsessed with college basketball, actually ACC basketball, and it inspired me to be the basketball manager at Wake Forest during the Tim Duncan era. So I was lucky to overlap with him. But I actually wrote to the coaches before I applied to the school and got the job contingent upon my acceptance at Wake Forest. It was a little backwards approach to college admissions, but that experience really defined my college years. And the players and coaches and staff became like a family to me. And really not a week goes by that I don't talk to someone involved in that program. Most notably the head coach, David Odom. We talk at least once a week. I just saw him this weekend, actually, Friday. But I think sports really unify us around this common passion and goal, and they bring people of diverse backgrounds together. When I look at some of the players over the 4 years when I was at Wake, we have very little in common except for this shared passion. And because of that, we're really bonded for life. So I drew on a lot of those experiences when I wrote The One and Only. But it's interesting, when I first told my editor that I was going to write this book set in the world of college football, and I changed it to football rather than basketball because I felt like I was almost too close to basketball. But she was concerned about my core demographic, which all the men out there, I bet there's like 2 of you who have read the book, if that. You might have seen the movie of Something Borrowed, but I argued to her that women do love sports, but certainly in Texas, they love football, and in the South, in Atlanta where I live, they love SEC football. And I also pointed out that you don't have to love football to enjoy this story, in the same way that like Rocky movies are among my favorite films, and I don't watch boxing. And the bottom line, The One and Only is still a very relationship-driven story. And to this point, I want to share this anecdote of I gave my manuscript in the early stages to 2 very iconic coaches for feedback. One is Jim Boeheim, a friend, obviously the head coach at Syracuse, second winningest coach right now, active coach behind Coach K. And then Pat Dye, of course, Auburn legend. So they both read it very quickly. And Coach Dye called me and said, I want to know how a Yankee from Chicago knows so much about college football. And I said, hold on a second, we have a bad connection. Called my husband, put it on speaker, and said, say that again. It's pretty thrilling feedback. But we didn't talk about football for long. He very quickly delved into the relationship to one of the characters in the book, the fictitious Dallas Cowboy quarterback, Ryan James. And he said, I know Ryan James did some bad things, but I don't think he was a bad guy. And I think it was great the way you didn't make it too black and white. And I really understood him. And I had a daddy like him who could be, could be really tough, and felt sorry for him, and I have hope for him. And then he went on to talk about the Lucy character in the book, who's the daughter of the head coach, Carr, and he said, I understood Lucy. He said, my daughter went through a lot of that growing up, and she felt like she was always taking a back seat to the sport. It's really tough to be the daughter, particularly of a head coach, and I understood Lucy. So that feedback meant a lot to me. And then there was Jim Boeheim, who I know a little better than I know Coach Dye, and I was very specific that he's a huge reader. He reads like 2 novels a week. But I said, I want you specifically to read this towards the eye of the NCAA investigation subplot. They're always getting in trouble up there in Syracuse. He'd be mad if I said that, but it's true. So he read it, he called, he said, yeah, you got all that right. It was good that you made the one issue happen, years back, because now the reporting the rules have changed and you got that right. But let's talk about Lucy and Shay, who are the friendship, this core friendship in the story. He said, I think that ultimatum that Lucy delivered was ridiculous and unfair, and I think that Shay would never have listened, and I don't think Coach would have listened, and I think what you could do is add more backstory to really explain the dysfunction in that friendship. And I said, Coach, I'm not going to tell you about your zone defense. And I don't need help with Shay and Lucy. Just tell me if the NCAA investigation. Interesting, though, I did make one of his changes because my editor had the same suggestion. But I think their feedback reinforces one thing. Women love football, and men care about relationships. I mean, no matter what our hobbies and professions are, and passions, I think it all comes down to relationships. If I stopped writing today, I would miss it, but I'd still be the mother of Edward, George, and Harriet, and Buddy's my husband's wife, and my friendships would still matter, and I think that really, it defines who we are, who we love, and who loves us back. It also reminds me of why I write. So for 7 books, I've created characters who are basically good people, making very unsympathetic choices. And I hope, as I always try to carry it as far to the line as I can, and hope that my readers will root for these characters, very flawed people, in spite of what they're doing. And I think empathy is so important in life and in fiction, and whether it's forgiving those who have hurt us or trying to make amends for the missteps that we've made in our lives. And I think this driving sense of empathy is one of the many gifts that books give our children. And another reason why I'm so proud to be supporting this important cause. So I want to wish a happy 25th birthday to the Barbara Bush Foundation, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Emily. Gary Haugen is an admired international humanitarian who founded International Justice Mission in 1997 to protect the world's most vulnerable people from violence. In his most recent book, The Locust Effect, Gary describes the growth of violence as a plague of locusts spreading across the world. Gary knows firsthand how hard it is to stop tyranny from his experience at the U.S. Department of Justice prosecuting ruthless perpetrators during the Rwanda genocide. He continues to work with local law enforcement officials, police, and judges to change systems that allow ongoing violence. Gary, as Texans, we thank you for what you're doing to help those in desperate need across the world and in our country. So please help me in welcoming Gary Haugen.
Well, thank you, George, for the very kind introduction, and I'm very grateful to the Barbara Bush Foundation to get to be here on the silver anniversary and to be part of what is already just truly a magnificent celebration of reading. Historically, one of the most powerful things that reading is able to do is to transport us to places in the world to see massive and urgent needs, but not to just leave us there into despair, but actually then point to a path of hope and to a better future. And this, of course, is the dream for me of this book that we've now written called The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. It's ironic that I, of all people, would be writing a book about poverty and violence, because I could not have grown up farther from both of those things. I grew up as the youngest of 6 kids in an affluent suburban home in California, in a world favored with abundance and security and opportunity. My dad was a doctor and a very loving and kind man. My mom was a stay-at-home mom who took great care of us, and while my 5 older siblings might have said I was spoiled, I preferred to think that I was just well loved. I was privileged with a Harvard education and got a law degree from the University of Chicago, and then sought to try to make a difference with that in that legal profession by actually joining the U.S. Department of Justice under President George H.W. Bush and serving as a civil rights lawyer, focusing mainly on cases of police abuse and police corruption here in the United States. But in 1994, my life took a very different turn. In the summer of 1994, you might remember that there was this little country in Africa called Rwanda that was just engulfed in a genocide. And when it was all over, I was put on loan from the Department of Justice to the United Nations to actually lead the Rwandan genocide investigation. And this is where the introduction of my book begins. And I write this. I say, in those early days, my task was to help the UN's Commission of Experts make a gross accounting of what had taken place and to begin to gather the evidence against the leaders of the genocide. With hundreds of thousands of murderers, where were we supposed to start? We ended up starting in Ntarama, a small town south of Kigali, in a small church compound where all the bodies remained just as their killers had left them, strewn wall to wall in a knee-high mass of corpses, rotting clothes, and desperate personal effects of very poor people who were trying to survive a siege. But they did not survive. And what eventually emerged for me and changed me was a point of simple clarity about the nature of violence and the poor. What was so clear to me was the way that these very impoverished Rwandans, at their point of most desperate need, huddled against those advancing machetes in that church, did not need someone to bring them a sermon or food or doctors or a teacher or a microloan. They needed someone to restrain the hand with the machete, and nothing else would do. None of the other things that people of goodwill had sought to share with these impoverished Rwandans over the years was going to matter if those good people could not stop the machetes from hacking them to death. Moreover, none of those good things, the food, the medicine, the education, the shelter, the fresh water, the microloans, was going to stop the hacking machetes. The locus of predatory violence had descended, and they would lay waste to all that the vulnerable poor had otherwise struggled to scrape together to secure their lives. So in my introduction to the book there, I'm trying to reflect a bit on my experience in Rwanda and the way it brought me face to face with a massive problem in our world, and that's the problem of violence against the poor. And so after coming back from that experience, I sought to try to do something about it. I left my job at the U.S. Department of Justice and started something called the International Justice Mission out of the guest room of our little townhouse in Washington, D.C. The idea was simple: to provide direct service to very poor victims of the most violent abuse in the world's poorest communities, people who are too poor to pay for anyone else to help them. And this was the original global headquarters of International Justice Mission. where likewise we were bringing into the world twin girls and then 2 boys swiftly thereafter. And now, almost 20 years later, IJM supports the world's largest team of local advocates, of investigators and social workers and lawyers, who in the developing world protect their own neighbors, their poorest neighbors, from violence in about 20 different offices around the globe. And now in our book, The Locust Effect, we try to share something of what it is that we've learned. And what we've discovered is that the brokenness of justice systems in the developing world has unleashed an epidemic of everyday violence against the poor. Indeed, studies now show that 4 billion people in the world live outside the protection of law. What does that mean, to live outside the protection of law? It means that billions of the world's poorest people live in a chronic vulnerability to violence because they have no justice system to defend them. They face a hidden epidemic, especially of violence against girls, of families being taken into modern-day slavery, of widows and orphans being thrown off their land, and of futures destroyed by marauding gangs of police. For a young girl like Laura, for example, who's living in a slum in Kenya, it means being assaulted by 3 different men on 3 different occasions in her neighborhood before she's even 11 years old. But fortunately, this is where we get to tell a different story. In our book, we share a story of what it looks like for us now to be in Laura's neighborhood and actually fight for her. IJM has been able to bring all 3 of Laura's assailants to justice, and that is the local Kenyan IJM team. And they're working with local authorities to make her whole community safe. And now Laura is able to thrive in safety, and she enjoys the childhood that she deserves. Indeed, what the Locust Effect demonstrates is that we can give all manner of goods and services to the poor, but if we don't restrain the bullies from taking it all away, we won't have very much to show for all of our efforts. This is why our book is called The Locust Effect, because of the way violence swoops into the poorest communities and has the power to destroy everything in its path. For example, as you may know, studies are now showing that perhaps the most powerful thing we can do to fight poverty is to provide for girls' education. But what studies are also now showing is that the primary reason that girls are not attending schools in the developing world is because of violence. Thankfully, our book tries not only to expose the problem, but also, again, point to a path of hope. And we demonstrate that it's actually possible now in our world to take broken and totally corrupt justice systems in very poor communities and actually turn them into a force for good. For example, we tell the story of a mega city in the Philippines called Cebu that had a massive problem of child sex trafficking. But thanks to help from the Gates Foundation, our very local IJM team in the Philippines there was able to work with the local authorities to train special units of police to attack the problem. We helped them actually find the traffickers, to rescue hundreds of children, and to make sure that they had safe places where they could be restored to safety and to strength. Our IJM team and local authorities also sent scores of traffickers to jail, where specially trained prosecutors and courts were able then to bring them to justice. Now, the goal of this whole project was to try to see if outside auditors could measure from all these activities a 20% reduction in the victimization of children in the commercial sex trade. But 4 short years later, outside auditors found it had been reduced by nearly 80%. And now Filipino girls like Myla don't have to fear the traffickers anymore, and they're restored to the abundant life for which they were created. This is all good news, that change is possible all over the world.